In this video, it will be illustrated how the repressed unconscious originates through a mechanism which Freud called primal repression. It will also be shown how this mechanism leads at the same time to the formation of the preconscious system of the ego, thus dividing from that moment onward the psychic apparatus into two parts. We will also see how the mental apparatus develops through a series of additional and subsequent primal repressions that Freud called organic repressions, which contribute to the formation of the repressed or dynamic unconscious. After the experience of satisfaction has occurred, a further act of the psychic apparatus, which Freud called primal repression, takes place. It follows the primal defense and serves to prevent the apparatus from malfunctioning. That is to say, to work through the hallucination of the wish rather than the search for an object in the external reality. It ends with the formation of the original nucleus of the repressed unconscious and the formation of the preconscious system of the ego, thus leading to the organization of the psychic apparatus. This primal repression is triggered by displeasure, which prevents the recathexis of the experience of satisfaction and its hallucination. It can be graphically represented between the id and the preconscious part of the ego. It fundamentally establishes the suppression of a functioning that is inefficient for the discharge and harmful for the mental apparatus. Its occurrence implies the establishment of the second level of binding, secondary process, and the regime of the reality principle. In this sense, this function of the primal repression inaugurates the preconscious system. Due to the establishment of the primal repression, the primitive and indispensable split of the psychic apparatus takes place, and the psychic subject results in division. That is to say, constituted by a preconscious ego and a dynamic unconscious. In summary, for the freely moving energy of the primary process to become bound, a second level of binding or fixation is needed. This fixation involves the passage from the primary to the secondary process, from the pleasure principle to the reality principle, and from hallucinatory realization of wishes to the satisfaction through a specific action. The primal repression is a psychic act performed by the ego, which inhibits the primary processes and transforms them into secondary ones. We will see this mechanism in more detail in the next video. The ego stores energy, thus passing from the purified pleasure ego to the definitive reality ego, which is now capable of performing a specific action in accordance with the reality principle. The primary process and the governing path with its hallucinatory end are instead relegated to the dreamlike register. They will continue to exert their power from the unconscious as purposive ideas, which attract the preconscious and conscious trains of thought. Where does the ego take the energy needed to perform the specific action? The mechanism of this primal repression consists of inhibiting the cathexis of certain mnemic traces, over-cathecting others, originating what Freud called anti-cathexis. In the case of this primal repression, anti-cathexis means that the psychic energy, which until then had cathected the representation of the hallucinatory satisfaction experience, is now linked to a specific action. A second main function that Freud attributes to the primal repression is that of inhibiting pre-genital satisfactions. As has been previously said, the Freudian psychoanalytic theory distinguishes between sexuality and genitality by equating sexuality with pleasure. Therefore, the same excitement is discharged by generating pleasure through the functions of different organs. It is a sexuality that permeates the functions of the whole organism and is called genitality only when it is discharged by genital activity. During growth and development, the individual goes through stages in which the important function of an organ takes a primacy over all others, to the point that the entire psychic apparatus is affected by it. According to Freud, we go through these phases of libidinal development in which this primacy resides first in the oral area, then in the anal, and only later in the phallic. The second function of the primal repression is biologically predetermined and can be considered as a defense against the previous animal nature of mankind. However, also the education provided by significant others contributes to its establishment and reinforcement. Freud relates this type of primal repression to the renunciation of drives, which is at the basis of both cultural development and cultural malaise, as this renunciation implies the end of full sexual satisfaction. From inhibition, symptom, and distress, he stated that the organic repression also affects the death drive. This primal repression, that Freud also calls organic primal repression, is directly related to the parental law of prohibition of incest and parricide and its observance. It therefore ends with the decline of the Oedipus complex and the emergence of its heir, the superego. It can be graphically represented again between the id and the preconscious ego. According to Freud, there are as many organic primal repressions as there are stages in the development of the libido. So each time that a libidinal stage is abandoned in the process of development, the corresponding drives are affected. This second function of the primal repression closes the access to the external object for the direct satisfaction of that drive. It prevents the achievement of the specific action, and by doing so, it works in the opposite way to the previous function of the primal repression. The direct and effective discharge of a specific drive is closed, and what was once a satisfaction is now felt as being unpleasant. From that moment onward, discharges can only occur through substitute paths. Both the lack of this repression and its establishment in the psyche can lead to psychopathology, as the organic repression is a necessary condition for the proper repression. Proper repression will be explained in the following videos.